This is the 80th year of the founding of Black Mountain College. And it's really hard for me to believe it, but it's the 20th anniversary of our little organization. During that 20 years, we've had a lot of help from a lot of people. We've had wonderful volunteers and wonderful board members. But this evening, I would like to honor two very, very special women. Unfortunately, Juanita Somerville is in the hospital right now and is not able to be here with us. Juanita was on the board very early on in the organization's life. She was somebody who was always inspiring. She was always impeccable in every way. Everything about her spoke traditional Southern lady, except that she had a wicked sense of humor and was always lots of fun and brightened our day no matter what. So unfortunately, she's not here to accept her little award. But Charlie Griffin, who was here 10 years ago on our board, is with us this evening. And I'd like to present this to Charlie. Charlie has done just about everything you can imagine. Charlie was a dance instructor for Arthur Murray. She got a pilot's license when most women didn't even drive cars. She raised a family. She was an entrepreneur. And I think she was probably just about 70 years old when she decided to get a master's degree in studio art and has been a wonderful abstract painter. But she was a great board member and meant an awful lot to this organization. So thank you, Charlie. We really appreciate everything you do.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to campus, and welcome to the highlight of this wonderful conference focused this year on shaping, craft, and design. I'm Jane Fernandez. I'm the provost here, and I have the honor and privilege of being with you again. And I often say that one of the true joys of my job at UNC Asheville is the opportunity to participate in and welcome people to events like this, and sometimes to meet and introduce brilliant and phenomenal individuals like our keynote speaker. Curious to learn more about Christopher Benfey, author, Emily Dickinson scholar, Mellon Professor of English and Acting Dean of Faculty at Mount Holyoke College. Whoa, that's a lot, right? And wanting to learn about his connection to Black Mountain College, I recently read his fabulous book, Red Brick, Black Mountain, White Clay, Reflections on Art, Family, and Survival. The book is a joy and a marvel to read, and reveals that Dr. Benfey not only is a distinguished scholar, consummate researcher, and gifted writer, he has the heart, soul, and eye of an artist. No surprise, perhaps, given that he is the grandnephew of Annie Albers, and thus a descendant of Black Mountain College. Red Brick, Black Mountain, White Clay is a genre-bending work weaving together threads plucked from family memoir, key figures of world history and art history, an informed critique of the work of artists and crafters. And to my reading anyway, the theme, structure, design, and very soul of the book is the meander. The meander pattern we recognize from ancient Grecian art, a continuous line shaped into a repetitive interlocking motif, like a labyrinth in linear form. It looks like this. Some of these are on your tables. In one sense, the book is a leisurely, meandering journey, stopping in places like Mexico, Germany, Japan, Jogtown, Greensboro, Asheville, Black Mountain, and the Great Smoky Mountains. It starts at the slowly winding Whitewater River of Dr. Benfey's hometown in Richmond, Indiana, where his father taught chemistry at Quaker-founded Earlham College, sister to Guilford College, his mother's alma mater. He himself attended both schools and went on to earn a Ph.D. in Comparative Literature, a field dear to my own heart, from Harvard University, although I didn't earn mine from Harvard University. But the certainty of the meander to the book becomes apparent in the passage about Ani and Joseph Albers at Black Mountain College. Professor Benfey writes, after their arrival in America, the Albersers came to see the meander as an emblem of their own winding path through the world. The meander confirmed their interest in the ambiguities of human vision. One was never quite sure whether the pattern was made by the line itself or by the surrounding spaces it created. It was both intricate and simple. One could say the same about Christopher Benfrey's book, and by extension, I think about the man himself. And perhaps the same could be said about all of our lives. Now, I know I've talked more about my impressions of his book than Christopher Benfrey himself. But in a meandering way, I mean to convey that our keynote speaker knows how to weave together a great story, has a connection with and insights into some of the great minds of Black Mountain College, and is here to share them with us today. We are glad and grateful Christopher Benfrey found his way back to Asheville and Black Mountain. Please welcome him warmly.
Boy, after that, I feel I don't even have to give the talk. All so beautifully said. Thank you, Jane. So generously said. It's a great disadvantage to go last at a conference like this. All the things one took for granted and was so sure of have been undercut and undermined by so many talks this week. And so these are just my thoughts as of Thursday afternoon. One of the most heartening things about this conference for me is, if I may use the phrase, how many young people came to this conference. I was invited last week to a conference in Vermont on Rudyard Kipling, and I don't think there was anyone under 60 there, except me. And the young scholars here, brilliant young scholars, you know who you are, give us such hope for the continuing survival of this school that I think all of us know never died. Many thanks to Alice Sebrel, whose dreams of this of the survival of Black Mountain are so full of energy, and thanks to Katie Lee Coven, thanks to Jane Fernandez and UNC Asheville, the many entities, the Wingate Foundation, the NC Arts Council, who made this conference possible. I'm very touched to see so many people I know out in the crowd. It is disarming. As Jane mentioned, I owe an even greater debt to Mount Holyoke, to easy slip, to the other mountain school, Black Mountain College itself. It recently dawned on me that I owe my very existence to Black Mountain College. My German Jewish family escaped from Nazi Germany because of Black Mountain College. Ani and Joseph, as you all know, were invited to come to Black Mountain, Ani and Joseph Albers, in 1933, after the Nazis shut down the Bauhaus School, for promoting, among other things, degenerate Jewish and communist art. Ani was of Jewish background. Joseph was not. Joseph became head of Black Mountain College and remained in that capacity until 1949, and Ani taught weaving. In 1939, as conditions in Germany became increasingly intolerable for people the Nazis classified as Jews, Joseph and Ani engineered Ani's little sister's immigration to America, along with her children. Annie's little sister was my grandmother, and one of her children was the man who would be my father if we could get him to this country so he could marry the charming Tar Heel he married, who was my mother. All in the family. Our family survived, as I say, because of the school whose survival we are celebrating today. And survival is what I'd like to talk about for the next 35, 40 minutes. I know many of you have been listening for many, many hours. And if you like, maybe we can have a couple of questions at the end. So I propose that we try to think about survival in three basic areas. First, I want us to think about the survival of craftspeople in dark times. In this regard, I'm thinking primarily of Black Mountain people like Annie Albers and Ruth Asawa, who ran up against some of the most fiendish racist practices of the 20th century. Annie fled Germany because of Hitler's concentration camp regime. Ruth Asawa, the great weaver of industrial wire who died this year, came of age in American concentration camps for American citizens of Japanese ancestry. So the first thing let's think about is the survival of craftspeople in dark times. Second, I hope we can give some thought to the survival of craft traditions in mid-20th century America. The major threat to craft traditions during the 19th and 20th century was, of course, the Industrial Revolution. The crafts, Annie Albers wrote in 1944, the crafts, they have had a long rest. Industry overran them. And here we run up against an interesting fact. The artists I care most about from the two iterations of Black Mountain, Annie and Joseph Albers, Karen Carnes, Ruth Asawa, John Cage, among others. These people did not reject industrial methods as long as industry was conscious of the materials and honest in their use and handling. The Bauhaus wanted to revolutionize industry, not to destroy it. Annie loved industrial-produced textiles like rayon, because they were new materials with new possibilities. For similar reasons, Ruth Asawa liked industrially manufactured wire. Karen Carnes, as Peter Held reminded us a minute ago, got her initial training at the pottery wheel and with kiln firing among industrial potteries in Italy. The Black Mountain ethos favored honesty toward materials and was, from the outset, a little bit ambivalent about craft, and for at least two reasons. First of all, they associated craft with hobbies and therapy for an overworked bourgeoisie. For this reason, Annie Albers dismissed pottery as, quote, ashtray art. The second reason for this ambivalence toward craft was that many of these emigres from Germany associated craft with reactionary nationalism, the folk with a capital V of the Third Reich and all the various horrors of kitsch. As I don't need to tell you, we live in a time when the major threat to crafts during the 20th century, namely the Industrial Revolution, has yielded to an even less hands-on development, the post-industrial or digital age. The word digital carries a heavy irony for craftspeople. Digital means having to do with the fingers of the hand, but nothing has done more to remove the materials of the actual world from our hands and our arms and our eyes than the digital revolution, even as we cut and paste and use Dreamweaver and so on. So the first thing, the survival of craftspeople in dark times. The second thing, the survival of craft traditions in dark times. And third, I want to think about the survival of craft-based education, also called progressive education or experimental education. This kind of education, I believe, is endangered and under siege everywhere today. Craft was, and I passionately believe still is, essential to the survival of progressive education. My talk, such as it is composed of 10 short sections, or rather fragments. As I get older, I found that my thinking becomes increasingly fragmentary, probably the result of dead or damaged brain cells, missing synapses. I will read the numbers aloud so that you can gauge how close we are coming to the end of the tunnel. This happens to be the final sentence of section 1, so you see we're already making rapid progress through this little mini course in Survival 101. 2. Ani and Joseph Albers arrived at Black Mountain College in 1933 with nothing, and they found a school with pretty much nothing. No money to speak of, no facilities to speak of. And they found this a cause for celebration. There was nothing, Ani said, and there was a chance to build something up. And in other places, there was already a framework, and you had to fit in, squeeze in. And so that made Black Mountain especially desirable, and we loved it for that reason. At Black Mountain College, Ani Albers developed a classroom exercise that she called Starting at Zero. Here is what Ani said in her slightly inventive English. What intrigued me in regard to teaching was that I think something should be reversed in teaching. We always, in architecture or whatever you do, you start from what there is today and try to explain it. While I was trying to set a task, put the students on absolute zero, in the desert, in Peru, nothing is there. What is the first thing you have to think of and build up? And maybe, for instance, something for fishing or something for the roof. You gradually develop something, inventions, as you go along. And some of the students like also the idea of not being told a brick is done like this and we build it like this, but how we arrive at the brick. I love that. How we arrive at the brick. At least once in life, Ani Albers liked to say, it's good to start at zero. And we can see in this wonderful passage that in Ani's view of education, there's a bedrock linkage of craft, manufacture, handicraft, and survival. People started making things, bricks, weavings, pots, roofs, in order to survive. Put the students on absolute zero in the desert in Peru. Put them in Asheville. Students at Black Mountain College were encouraged to start from scratch. At first, there were no funds for looms. How can you practice weaving without looms? But Ani, undeterred, figured out ways to weave without looms. She encouraged the students to weave with sticks and pebbles and leaves and corn on the bare ground. And of course, the students learned things about patterns and textures that gave them a new appreciation, a new feel for weaving when they got around to weaving with threads. Ani's husband, Joseph Albers, had his own way of defining starting from zero. Albers thought that students did way too much research and not enough search. He hated schools, as he put it, that, quote, turn out individuals stuffed with facts instead of a creative, intellectually curious population, end of quote. 3. Let me give another example of search rather than research, of experimenting with materials rather than simply driving with one hand on the wheel and the other sending text messages along the information highway. Annie Albers was interested in exploring jewelry design with her students. There was a problem. Annie's jewelry had been confiscated by the Nazis. My grandmother's jewelry was also confiscated by the Nazis. A heartbreak for us. And she had no funds for jewels or for fine metals for her students to work with. What to do? Just as her students found ways to weave without looms, they found ways to make jewelry without jewels. Annie's collaborator on these projects was a shy Black Mountain student and later teacher named Alex Reed. One of Reed's paintings, very interesting watercolor, is in the eye-opening exhibition at the Black Mountain College Museum and Art Center. Annie and Alex Reed, or also known as Bill Reed, found materials for making jewelry in the local hardware store. With bobby pins hanging from a metal-plated ball-link chain, they made a necklace that looks like something an African warrior might wear into battle. A chain attached with 2 paper clips to a dish drain strainer with more paper clips fanning out from the lower arc suggested a fusion of silver and feathers out of the American Southwest. In a speech, number 4. In a speech she gave at Black Mountain in 1942, Annie explained that the jewelry she was making with hardware was inspired by archaeological excavations at the Temple of Monte Alban in Mexico, which she and Reed had visited together. Quote, "These objects of gold and pearls, of jade, rock crystal, and shells made about 1,000 years ago," she remarked, "are of such surprising beauty in unusual combinations of materials that we become aware of the strange limitations in materials commonly used for jewels today." A little while ago, Jess Jones was talking about these experiments in the combination of materials and mentioned as an aside that Robert Rauschenberg's combines may have something to do with that instigating idea. The Mexican jewelry seemed to Annie to have arisen from experiments in combination and interaction, like those that she and Joseph had arranged in the Black Mountain classroom. Rock crystal with gold, pearls with simple seashells. Back in North Carolina, Annie and Bill Reed looked for new materials to use. In the 5 and 10 cent stores in Asheville, we discovered the beauty of washers and bobby pins. Enchanted, we stood before kitchen sink stoppers and glass insulators, erasers. The art of Monte Alban had given us the freedom to see things detached from their use as pure materials worth being turned into precious objects. Annie was asked during the spring of 1942 to describe the work that she and Reed had been doing and to relate it to national defense. "Though our work has nothing to do with defense work," she explained, "there was something right in asking to connect it with it." She added, however, that, quote, "For many of us, our part cannot be that of going into a munitions factory or that of helping those who suffer in this war in a direct way. Many of us are tied to our homes, to our normal circle of action, to our work continuing as usual." Now, Annie was asking her audience to think more deeply about what constitutes our normal circle of action and our work continuing as usual. War, she seemed to be arguing, was the opposite of the normal and the usual. It was in the context of everyday life that she felt that something new might be accomplished and some opening might be achieved to a more hopeful, less violent future. The value of these pieces of jewelry was not in the materials used, which could hardly have been more common, but rather in their, quote, "surprise and inventiveness, a spiritual value," she wrote. And war, she implied, was a matter of competing over mistaken ideas about what was truly precious, worth fighting for, worth possessing. 5. Here it is tempting to see a parallel with the famous ready-mades of Marcel Duchamp. Duchamp, as you all know, exhibited an ordinary urinal and also a snow shovel as high art. By coincidence, Duchamp was one of the first people Joseph and Annie met in America. They arrived in New York City on Thanksgiving weekend in 1933 and met Duchamp over dinner at Ted Dreyer's parents' house in Brooklyn Heights. Joseph Albers pronounced Duchamp, quote, a great fellow. It's always worth remembering that artistic creations can look very similar and mean opposite things. There is something nihilistic in Duchamp's famous urinal, which he exhibited under the title Fountain. My impression is that in displaying the urinal, he was trying to devalue our received notions of high art rather than to give value to the unexpected beauty of the porcelain urinal. Joseph Albers thought wastepaper baskets were beautiful and consisted of the perfect marriage of form and function. One doesn't feel that Duchamp was thinking in the same way. Displaying a urinal for Duchamp was like painting a mustache on the Mona Lisa. But nonetheless, a great fellow. Annie's spiritualizing of washers and dish drains and paper clips has many parallels at Black Mountain, where finding spiritual value in commonplace things was part of the atmosphere. John Cage's affirmation of ambient sounds in his so-called silent piece, 433. Merce Cunningham's affirmation of ordinary movement, like walking and sitting and running, rather than turnout and arabesque and so on. Joseph Albers' use of fallen leaves in the collages. This is a perfect time of year to be celebrating that discovery of Albers's. These were all part of an approach to materials that was democratic, non-discriminatory, and, to use Annie's word, spiritual. Number 6. Ruth Asawa was another survivor in dark times, someone else who learned the value of everyday objects during a time of national and international crisis. As a third grader in 1939, Asawa won a prize for her drawing of the Statue of Liberty in a contest to express what it means to be an American. 3 years later, in 1942, Asawa's Japanese-American family was rounded up and placed in a horse stall at the Santa Anita racetrack outside of San Francisco. Then the family was shipped by train like cattle to an internment camp in Arkansas. Jenny Sorkin's wonderful talk got us really up close and personal with what those camps were like. The children attended school at the camp where they were required to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. After the words, "with liberty and justice for all," Asawa and her friends added, "except for us." Asawa's ability in art was noticed, and she received a scholarship from the Society of Friends, the Quakers, who took a strong interest in the well-being of intern Japanese Americans. She studied at a teacher's college in Wisconsin, but learned that there was no possibility for a Japanese American to teach there. Attracted by the murals of Diego Rivera, Asawa spent the summer of 1945 studying art in Mexico. She watched Jose Orozco at work and took lessons in fresco painting. She also worked in Mexico with a Cuban-born furniture designer named Clara Porcett, who urged her to enroll at Black Mountain and study with Porcett's close friend, Joseph Albers. Asawa found a new view of life and art at Black Mountain. At first, she planned to study weaving with Annie Albers, who sent her to Joseph's design class instead. There she learned about handling materials. Every material has several voices, she wrote in her notes for one of Albers's classes. Let's find out different possibilities. Asawa was fascinated by the class exercises in the juxtaposition of materials, something else that Jess Smith has been doing with her, Jess Jones has been doing with her students. She was fascinated by the class exercises in the juxtaposition of materials, finding ways of making one thing resemble a very different thing. Leather equals peanut butter, she wrote in her notebook. The whole ethos of the class, making art out of leaves and other found objects, suggested a morality and an aesthetic based on scarcity, sustainability, and the avoidance of waste. One of her favorite maxims from Joseph Albers was, get 5 cents from 3 cents. She also liked how Albers used analogies from Taoism and other Asian philosophical traditions in the classroom. Seven. Asawa's mature work, as she developed it in San Francisco during the 1950s, was a sustained engagement with procedures begun during the Black Mountain years. She had spent the summer of 1947 in a village outside of Mexico City, sponsored by the American Friends Service Committee. Joseph and Ani were also in Mexico that summer on sabbatical, and they traveled with Asawa and looked at their friend Diego Rivera's murals together. Back in her village, Asawa was fascinated by the wire baskets made by local women who used them to carry fruits and vegetables to market. That summer, she learned from them to knit with packing wire, a cast-off material of the kind favored by the Alberses. There's an unbelievable example of Asawa's knitting, weaving with packing wire at the Black Mountain Museum and Arts Center now, just one of her great pieces. Get 5 cents from 3 cents. Asawa discovered ways to make a continuous line of wire take on thickness as it was looped and threaded, and then volume as the single thread of wire was knitted into a vessel. Another influence was Japanese pottery with its long tradition of humble aesthetics. She saw, as we've heard several times today, the Japanese potter Shoji Hamada, the great Japanese folk potter, making pots in California during his 1952 tour of the United States, when he also visited Black Mountain and inspired Karen Carnes. 8. Where did Asawa and the Alberses and Cage and Cunningham and Carnes find inspiration for this openness to new experience and new materials? Where did they learn that search is better than research? Where did they find the courage to take a long detour from the information highway and strike out on their own? And why does all this sound somehow so American, so deeply a part of what William Carlos Williams called the American grain? I wrote those words, by the way, when I had no idea that I would see the cover of William Carlos Williams's In the American Grain in Julie Thompson's talk, with not one cover, but 2. The cover that Alvin Lustig designed for it, and then Ray Johnson's famous open hand cover of William Carlos Williams's great book. The Bauhaus, of course, the Bauhaus was also known for its experiential and open-ended approach to learning in design and the applied arts. But where then did Bauhaus luminaries, such as Walter Gropius and Albers, find inspiration for this emphasis on experience in education? They found it, believe it or not, in John Dewey, a personal friend of Black Mountain founder John Andrew Rice. Dewey also served as a member of the Black Mountain College Advisory Board. Dewey's books were translated into German, and his ideas about art experience and education were well known at the Bauhaus as well. So, when Joseph Albers crossed the ocean with his suitcase full of Bauhaus ideas to transplant to Black Mountain, one of the major things in his suitcase was the ideas of Dewey regarding education for democracy, the relation between art and experience, and the fundamental idea that education should be open-ended, exploratory, adventurous. John Dewey's prose is an acquired taste. But I did want to quote a few lines from his book, Democracy and Education, on the question of where thinking and creativity starts from. Here's what Dewey has to say on the nature of thinking as risky, adventurous, incomplete, like placing an oar in the water of what he calls repeatedly, something going on. Something going on. So this is Dewey. The starting point of any process of thinking is something going on. Something which, just as it stands, is incomplete or unfulfilled. To say that thinking occurs with reference to situations which are still going on and incomplete is to say that thinking occurs when things are uncertain, or doubtful, or problematic. Since the situation in which thinking occurs is a doubtful one, thinking is a process of inquiry, of looking into things, of investigating. It also follows that all thinking involves a risk. Certainty cannot be guaranteed in advance. The invasion of the unknown is of the nature of an adventure. We cannot be sure in advance, for we live not in a settled and finished world, but in one which is going on. Dewey wrote those words in 1916 during the uncertainty of World War I. And one thing I've been thinking a lot about lately is our own relation to those founding ideas of progressive education. Where exactly do we stand today in relation to them? And how can we be innovative and open-minded when the economy sucks? 9. And here we run up against a surprising fact. When was the last great period of creativity and experimentation in American higher education? The answer is the Depression. I find that most of the schools that have defined my life were founded during depressions. Guilford College and Mount Holyoke, my alma mater and my longtime employer, were founded during the horrible Depression of 1837. The Putney School, that commie, crafty experiment in Vermont where I attended high school, was founded during the 1930s. The Depression gave us Bennington, where the performing arts first entered the curriculum, and the Depression gave us Black Mountain College. Recently, thanks to the generosity of my friend Andrew Glasgow, I found some of the same spirit of creativity and experimentation at Penland. Hooray for Penland, where I plan to co-teach a course in creative writing and photography this summer. Anything to get back to that open-ended, something going on approach to education. What has made these schools so vital? I think that the profit motive was so distant that it barely entered the picture. These schools did not start with the question so urgent in higher education today, what can we cut? We deans of faculty know these. What can we cut? They started with the question so dear to John Dewey and to Ani Albers, where do we start? The fundamental question needs to be posed again today at our colleges and universities. Where do we start? Think of it this way. Where do our students start today? They start with Google, a very different number than 0, indeed, almost the opposite. Our students are led to believe that all questions have answers. Our students don't need more research. They actually need to learn how to de-search. To put it differently, our students and we ourselves have too many ways of not getting lost. GPS, Google, Facebook, iPhone. What we, their teachers, have to offer instead is a curriculum. A curriculum is not a set of straight paths to careers. It is not a set of well-traveled paths mapped out beforehand by the college. A curriculum is or ought to be a labyrinth, a meander to get safely lost in. It's a place to start, starting from zero. I heard two wonderful quotes from two different sessions in the last couple of days. One was Joseph Albers on the summer session of 1945. He said, "Less curriculum." And then in Tom Murphy's talk today on one of the printout promotions for Black Mountain, it said, "The curriculum can only be approximately predicted." 10. In 1982, Ani Albers was on a panel with John Cage and Peter Volkos to talk about, as we are talking about today, the art-craft connection at the College Art Association. And here's one of the things that she said, and we'll end with this. This is Ani again. How do we choose our specific material, our means of communication? Accidentally. Something speaks to us, a sound, a touch, hardness or softness. It catches us and asks us to be formed. We are finding our language, and as we go along, we learn to obey their rules and their limits. We have to obey and adjust to those demands. Ideas flow from it to us, and though we feel to be the creator, we are involved in a dialogue with our medium. The more subtly we are tuned to our medium, the more inventive our actions will become. Thank you.